Hey guys, welcome to the channel. We checked out Reason 11 yesterday, the new features that were added, the usability features. Personally, I wasn't that impressed. I thought they were a little bit clunky and poorly implemented. But today we're going to be checking out the Reason Rack VST inside Ableton, something that I am a lot more excited about. So this video is going to be broken into three different parts. First, I want to just go over what I noticed in the beta while I was testing it in a couple of different projects and show you guys some stuff that I discovered there. Then I want to talk just a little bit about how the Reason Rack kind of works as a VST and how that differs slightly from how we might be used to using the rack inside Reason as a standalone application. And then finally, I want to talk about some problems that myself and other people have identified with the rack that hopefully Reason Studios are going to address in the future, and some cool directions they could take with it. Because one thing I said yesterday, by the lack of any information about Reason as a standalone application on the Reason Studios website since the release, it appears that they're kind of straying away from that as their core thing that they're doing now. So let's jump in and have a look at how I've used the Reason Rack so far while I was beta testing it in some Ableton projects. So here's a session I've got in Ableton. This is just a short 8-bar house loop that I came up with. It sounds like this. Okay, so one thing I want to point out immediately that I noticed when I was making this track is the Reason Rack VST seems to be very resource heavy on the computer. For context, these are the specs on my MacBook Pro, and this is the buffer size that I'm running at the moment. I don't like to run any lower than 128 samples if I am recording and messing around with ideas on a MIDI keyboard. Preferably, I would be running at 64 samples or 32 samples, but if I put it at 64, like 64 works. It just increases the CPU load in Ableton. 32 doesn't work. This might not seem like a big deal. You'd be thinking, well, why don't you just increase the buffer size? But the reason that I think this is a big deal is when you play back and look at the CPU meter, keep in mind I'm only running 3 tracks in Ableton, and if you see what I've got going on in each track, it's fairly minimal. It's basically just a Reason Rack plugin in each instance. But at 128 samples, I'm still getting like 35% of my CPU being used in Ableton, which is pretty intense. That's pretty heavy. So I am using some quite extreme, well, I don't think it's that extreme. I'm using the rack how you might want to use the rack. In this first track, which is this blue one here, I've got a utility mixer here, master bus compressor on that. I'm using a player to trigger some chords from the MIDI data that I've got going on here, and I have 3 different instruments loaded into the rack. I've got this clang, I've got an LFO triggering something. I think the sweeper and the rotary speaker are running on an auxiliary effect channel from the line mixer here. Then I have a Europa as my second instrument and a flute as my third instrument. And I have automated the mute parameters to turn on for those second and third instruments so you can hear them like this. So that's how I was using the Reason Rack to play multiple instruments on one track in this instance. So that's the first track that I've got going on. The second one that I'm using is just a bass patch, where I layered 2 monotone bass synthesizers and a Europa that I'm mixing with that mixer there. Still not what I would consider immensely large in terms of stuff that could be in the rack. And then the third one that I'm using is just a Dr. Octa Rex. And one interesting thing to note about the Dr. Octa Rex when you're using this externally is how you go about triggering the loops to play back. In Reason, obviously we had create loop track or whatever it was called, where we could create pattern lane or something, where we could play back the patterns like that. But we don't have that inside Ableton. So what I discovered is that by playing these different notes in the piano roll, that triggers different loop playback. You can see as I click on these different notes here, it's changing what is being played back in terms of the loop. And other parameters in Dr. Octa Rex are also triggered in a similar way. So you can see as I'm moving my mouse along the piano roll right now, the global transpose is moving. So yeah, I really like this way of using Dr. Octa Rex. I think it's a good solution. It's not the most intuitive, like it took me a second to figure it out. I think the only reason that I figured it out so quickly is because I was used to using some of the other drum players in Reason which behave in a similar way. But regardless, it's great. It means we can still use Dr. Octa Rex as per usual. So yeah, that's the first track that I was working on, where I was essentially just using 3 tracks with fairly heavy stuff going on in the rack. I still don't think it's too extreme, and it's using quite a lot of load on my CPU. Alright, so the second track that I've been working on, I haven't mixed yet, but I am using Reason Rack as a whole load of effects. In a bunch of my channels you can see the Reason Rack just popping up all over the place. And so I don't think I've used any instruments from the Reason Rack in this song, but I am using a lot of effects. Other than that, this particular track is pretty much just audio with a couple of MIDI channels that are triggering samplers. So I'll just play a little bit of it and watch the CPU meter in this track, where I'm using a lot more instances of Reason, but only really using 1 or maybe 2 effects in each instance of the rack this time. My sample buffer size, my buffer size is still on 128 samples. yeah, throughout that track, the CPU on Ableton was sitting at around 30, give or take a little bit, which is actually less than it was at in the other track that I made, where there were only 3 tracks going on, but it was using the Reason instruments. This song is only using a lot of instances of the Reason Rack, but it's only using like Audiomatics or probably rather light effects in terms of CPU, even though there are a heck of a lot more tracks in this particular track. So going back to this little house track I made, let's talk about some of the things I noticed when I was using the Reason Rack plugin for the first time. First of all, you can't use tab to flip the rack anymore. You've got to actually click up here, which is whatever, you know, just something different to get used to when you're stuck using it the same way. And I found it particularly helpful to set up everything with some kind of mixer at the top. That way you can kind of use auxiliary effects and that kind of stuff. Or if you're layering instruments, it's a lot easier to do that. Because we don't have the SSL mixer inside Reason, there's no width control if you're panning, which I found a little frustrating. I wasn't really sure how to get around that. And the reason that was problematic for me was when I was trying to do sound design using multiple instruments inside one instance of the rack, I wasn't able to kind of change the width of the sound in the same way I would if I was using the SSL mixer on the other version of Reason. So yeah, that is something I'd like to see them integrate in the future, that SSL functionality. One other thing I noticed as I was testing this out is that because there's no longer VST anymore, you can't insert VST effects, which again is obvious, but that means if I wanted to use an instance of wider, for example, which is a VST that I like and use quite a lot, you have to have that separately after the Reason Rack. Now, where I might want it in the chain in the Reason Rack, I can't have it anymore. So that means that I either have to have 2 instances of the Reason Rack and split my chain in the Reason Rack so it starts in one instance and then goes through wider and then goes to another instance of the Reason Rack, or I just have to rethink completely how I chain stuff out. So that was one thing that took a little bit of adjusting to, was the fact that I could no longer integrate my VSTs inside Reason how I would like to, or how I was used to doing in the standalone version. And then the other biggest thing that I discovered, that was also the thing that most people were talking about in the comments as we were discussing this, is there's no MIDI out, which means that whatever you've got going on in the players, you can't send anywhere else. So you can't use the players in the Reason Rack to control other VSTs or other instruments inside Ableton, for example. In the standalone version, there was that button up here which let you print the MIDI data to the track, but you can't do that anymore, which is kind of frustrating. I do potentially have a solution though. So let's try it out. Alright, so I've just recorded the audio from this. Let's see if I can convert harmony to new MIDI track. Hello. How accurate is it though? That is the question. Alright, that's it's not the most accurate. That would probably be more accurate if I did it with a straight piano sound. So you can see that that's better. It's not great. So, you know, the moral of the story is there's still no real way of extracting what the players are doing inside the Reason Rack. There are a few hacks we can do, but I don't know if any of those hacks are working well enough that I'd actually want to kind of use them as a serious part of my workflow, which does kind of limit us to using the players just inside the Reason VST. Alright, so let's talk about some things that I would like to see Reason Studios add in the future with this VST rack situation. I am super excited about this. I think it's a really good direction for Reason Studios to be taking. I've really been enjoying using Ableton, but to be able to bring the Reason Rack inside it is awesome. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, there are a couple of things that are currently really frustrating. Chief among them being no MIDI out. So it would be really dope to see in future iterations of this a MIDI out function. Even if that's just kind of like a copy and paste thing, so we can, you know, drag what the player is doing onto the sequencer of whatever DAW we are using it in. Now, I have no idea if this is viable, but it would be super dope to be able to have VSTs open up inside the Reason VST in Ableton. A VST inside a VST, like VSTception. That'd be great, because the other biggest problem that I was having using this in the beta was I kept getting stuck because I'd be chaining something up and using the rack how I would have used it before in Reason, and I'd be like, oh, I need a VST here for that. And you know, that is possibly just me having to change the way I think about using the Reason Rack inside Ableton. But if there was a way to open a VST inside a VST, that would be sick. I don't really know much about the dev side of that, but I have a feeling maybe that's that's not realistic. The third thing that I think would be really dope to see in the future is some kind of SSL mixer integration. I love the SSL mixer in Reason. That's probably one of my favorite parts about Reason, other than the rack in general. And I would love to have the SSL mixer in some capacity up here in the Reason rack. Currently I'm having to do everything with this mini mixer or the other one that Reason's got, which just doesn't let you do anything really in terms of like width control like we talked about, or a lot of auxiliary stuff. And sure, you've got these channel strip things now, so you can have that EQ in there and whatnot, but that SSL mixer was amazing, and I think it would be awesome to have that in some capacity inside the Reason rack. And obviously it wouldn't hurt for it to be more efficient on the CPU. I haven't used it enough, I think, to really have made up my mind about whether or not it's currently a problem for me in terms of its kind of strain on the CPU. But if I'm having trouble with it with my computer, which is quite powerful, other people will find problems with it if they're using less powerful machines. So that's something that hopefully will be improved on in future updates as well. And then the last kind of thing that immediately struck me as I was testing it is I would really like there to be a preset option for the channel strip plugins, like the master bus compressor and the EQs and stuff. That would be really great as well. But yeah, that is my first impressions and thoughts about the Reason Rack VST. Overall, I really like it. I am very excited about the future of Reason inside other DAWs. I know that there's been a bunch of frustration around the updates to Reason as a standalone plugin, but I've kind of put that behind me. I don't really see myself using Reason as a standalone application anymore. I am pretty much going to be in Ableton full time, I think, using Reason as a VST. And yeah, obviously this is only the first release of it as a VST, so I'm sure there'll be heaps of improvements in the future, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing some of the suggestions that I suggested implemented in the future. That would be really great. But yeah, so there was just a video about my experience using the VST rack so far. I'm going to be making some videos with all of the new instruments and plugins over the next couple of weeks. There's a lot that I haven't used and haven't tested, so I'm going to be trying them in the Reason Rack inside Ableton. If there is anything that you want me to test regarding the Reason Rack inside Ableton, let me know. I'm sure I'll come across more things, so I'll address those in future videos. But if there's anything that you want me to specifically test or try out, let me know in the comments. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more content about Reason inside Ableton. And I'll catch you guys next time.